There was one house the Queen kept for herself, a plain stone lodge in the Scottish hills where almost no one was ever invited, and one of the very few people she brought there wasn't a prime minister or a fellow monarch. It was her sister's daughter. This is the story of the niece Queen Elizabeth quietly kept closest, and why she guarded her the way she guarded almost no one else. Craigowan Lodge doesn't announce itself. 7 bedrooms, plain granite walls, tucked at the edge of a forest on the Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire, roughly 1 mile from the main castle. From the lane that passes nearest to it, the building is almost invisible against the woodland. Grey stone against grey Scottish sky, smoke from the chimneys the only signal of occupancy. There are no formal gardens, no sweeping approach, no porte-cochere. Compared to Balmoral Castle itself, its turreted Scottish baronial silhouette, its 52 rooms, its history running back to the purchase Prince Albert made on behalf of Queen Victoria for £31,500 in 1852, Craigowan is essentially a comfortable house. That, as former royal butler Paul Burrell explained in a media interview, was rather the point. Former royal butler Paul Burrell described it plainly. She would retreat to Craigowan Lodge, he said, a quaint stone house in close proximity to the castle. She had no desire to open up the large castle. She simply wanted a cozy cottage to escape to. Every year, the Queen arrived in Scotland at the end of July, before Balmoral Castle had closed to tourists for the season. The household moved into Craigowan first, for a week or two, while the castle was still open to the public, then relocated to the main building in August once the season ended. Wilderness Scotland, with detailed knowledge of the Deeside estate, described it plainly. The royal family arrives in late July, stays at Craigowan Lodge for the first portion of the visit, then moves to the castle once it shuts to visitors. The lodge was the place the Queen went when she wanted to stop being an institution and simply be. Not open to tourists, not on any official program, not on any map the public had access to. It's where, according to multiple sources, Hello Magazine, The Daily Express, The Sun, and Yahoo News UK, the Queen chose to bring Lady Sarah Chatto. The specific framing varies across those reports. Some characterized it in stronger terms than the evidence strictly supports. One source described Sarah as the only family member permitted there, a claim that sits uneasily beside the documented history of other royals, including Prince Charles and Princess Diana in the 1980s, using the lodge during their marriage. What those reports consistently describe is something more plausible and more significant, that among the very small number of people the Queen chose for the most private space she kept, her niece was one of them. Not because she was required to be there, not because protocol demanded it, because the Queen wanted her there. That is the story. The lodge is where it becomes most concrete. To understand how that invitation was earned, you have to go back 60 years. On the morning of May 1st, 1964, at 8:20 a.m., a daughter was born at Kensington Palace in London. She was named Sarah Frances Elizabeth Armstrong Jones, 3 given names, 2 of which honored women on either side of her. Her maternal grandmother, Princess Elizabeth, who had by then been queen for 12 years, and her aunt, who was the same woman. She was the second child and only daughter of Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, and Anthony Armstrong Jones, 1st Earl of Snowdon. At birth, she was 7th in line to the British throne. As of 2026, she sits somewhere around 29th. The number tells you how far she was always going to drift from direct succession and how little of the story it captures. She was baptized in the private chapel at Buckingham Palace on July 13, 1964, and grew up in the nursery of Kensington Palace, apartment 1A, with her older brother David, later Viscount Linley, now the 2nd Earl of Snowdon. They were raised with a nanny named Verona Sumner. Their parents were, by the standards of the era, comparatively hands-on. Lord Snowdon was a photographer of genuine talent and a figure of wide reach across the London arts world. He taught his children to build things, to engage with craft and creative work, to make rather than merely consume. The nursery in Kensington Palace was, by multiple accounts, an environment of encouraged creativity. Both children absorbed it. David became a furniture designer of national reputation. Sarah became a painter. Summers went to the royal estates, Sandringham in Norfolk for the Christmas season, Balmoral in Aberdeenshire in August and September, and Balmoral, year after year, was where the family assembled in its most relaxed configuration. The Cairngorms National Park surrounds the estate's 50,000 acres. The River Dee runs cold and fast through the valley below the castle. Loch Nagar rises to 3,789 feet to the south. The sound at Balmoral, away from the castle itself, is wind in the heather and water in the burns, a particular Highlands silence that visitors consistently describe as unlike anything in the south. Princess Eugenie, speaking for the 2016 ITV documentary Our Queen at 90, reached for the plainest possible language to describe what it meant to her grandmother. "It's the most beautiful place on earth. I think Granny is the most happy there. I think she really, really loves the Highlands. Walks, picnics, dogs, a lot of dogs, there's always dogs, and people coming in and out all the time. It's a lovely base for Granny and Grandpa, for us to come and see them up there, where you just have room to breathe and run." For young Sarah Armstrong Jones, those summers at Balmoral meant cousins, Charles, Anne, Andrew, Edward. It meant an aunt who, in London, was the Queen of the United Kingdom, but at Balmoral materialized as a woman in a headscarf, walking fast across wet grass, reportedly capable of delivering, as Prince William later remembered about his own Balmoral childhood, the most almighty telling off, when grandchildren needed one. It meant landscape painting, the Aberdeenshire hills teaching Sarah's eye the particular quality of northern light, the way the colors compress in overcast weather, the way peat and heather flatten under cloud. These weren't incidental summers, they were formative ones. That was the world she arrived into each August. It would turn out to matter enormously, partly because of what she was arriving from. The home she left each September wasn't that world. Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones had married on May 6, 1960, at Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding in British history to be televised. The cameras showed a couple who were, by every visible measure, dazzling. She in Norman Hartnell, he in morning coat, described by more than one contemporary account as the most glamorous pairing in England. Armstrong Jones was created first Earl of Snowdon the following year. In the photographs from that first year of marriage, they look like a couple who have won something, who are moving through a world that is consistently delighted by them. The image didn't correspond to the domestic reality. Multiple biographers have documented that the marriage became fractious within years of the wedding. Both parties had affairs. The combination of Princess Margaret's volatile temperament and Lord Snowdon's restless, wide-ranging social ambitions produced a household that didn't operate on the frequency of quiet institutional stability. Lady Elizabeth Anson, great-niece of the Queen Mother, cousin of both the Queen and Princess Margaret, confidant of the Queen for decades, and a woman who attended more royal events over more years than almost anyone outside the family, described the particular character of Margaret's world to biographer Sally Bedell Smith in terms that didn't soften the contrast. Armstrong Jones, she said, had a very wide circle of friends. She met a different circle to the Queen: show business, theater, opera, which are things the Queen isn't terribly interested in. Margaret could make headlines easily. Prince Philip, Anson recalled, found Margaret genuinely difficult. He knew she worried the Queen. The marriage produced a quality of atmospheric tension that wasn't entirely invisible to the two children growing up inside it, even before the public rupture arrived. David Armstrong Jones was born in 1961. Sarah was born in 1964. They grew up in an apartment where the air between their parents had a charge to it, where the social world that surrounded their mother ran on performance and late nights and the attention of a glamorous set, and where their father was increasingly, demonstrably elsewhere. The public rupture arrived in February 1976. Tabloids published photographs of Princess Margaret with the considerably younger Roddy Llewellyn on the island of Mustique. The photographs were damaging in a specific way. They were intimate, they were unmistakably romantic, and they removed any plausible deniability from the state of the marriage. Within weeks of publication, Kensington Palace issued an announcement, unprecedented in its bluntness, that the couple had mutually agreed to live apart. There was no softening of the language. 2 years of formal separation, the statement confirmed, had preceded the announcement. Sarah was 11 years old. She would have been old enough to read, old enough to understand that the photographs on the front pages of the tabloids were of her mother. Old enough to understand what the announcement from Kensington Palace meant about the household she lived in. The New York Times, covering the subsequent divorce announcement in May 1978, framed it as the first dissolution of a marriage within the immediate royal family since the time of Henry VIII. That framing, measured, historical, treating it as a significant constitutional and social event, was the register of the serious press. The tabloid press was rather less restrained. Sarah was 14 years old by the time the divorce was finalized on July 11, 1978. Armstrong Jones remarried Lucy Lindsay Hogg that December, the same year as the divorce, a speed that underlined the completeness of the ending. After 1978, weekends were split depending on which parent she was with. Either Nyman's, the Armstrong-Jones family property in West Sussex, or Royal Lodge at Windsor, the Queen Mother's residence. Holiday time at Balmoral and Sandringham continued. Those estates belonged to the wider family, not to either parent's household. And at those estates, every summer, the Queen's world remained what it had always been, consistent, steady, professionally exacting, and privately warm. Royal biographer Ingrid Seward described a dimension of this period that is often overlooked. After Margaret's own divorce in 1978, as the Queen watched 3 of her own 4 children's marriages collapse in the 1990s, it was Margaret, experienced now in exactly that territory, who became able to offer advice rather than receive it. For the first time, Margaret felt she could give the Queen guidance rather than the other way around. She prided herself on being a good mother, and it made her feel that at least she had managed to get something right. The portrait that emerges is of a woman who, stripped of the external glamour that had defined her public identity, found that her genuine relationship with her children, the constancy she had given them despite the turbulence around them, was something the Queen herself, in those years of royal divorces, envied. Royal biographer Robert Hardman noted in Queen of Our Times that the divorces within the Queen's own household hit Elizabeth much more than she let on. A former palace staffer recalled her exclaiming, 3 out of 4, with sheer sadness and exasperation. This is the woman who was, simultaneously, a steady and protective presence in Sarah's life, a woman who understood, from intimate experience, what it cost a family when marriages failed and became tabloid property. She wasn't projecting that failure onto Margaret's daughter. She was, it seems, doing the opposite, keeping the door to a quieter life open and making sure it stayed open. On July 29, 1981, Sarah Armstrong Jones stood in a pale yellow dress at St. Paul's Cathedral in London as one of the bridesmaids in the wedding party of her cousin, the Prince of Wales, and Lady Diana Spencer. She was 17 years old. St. Paul's was chosen over Westminster Abbey specifically because it was larger. Its nave could accommodate 2,500 guests rather than the Abbey's 2,000, and the procession route allowed for the maximum possible crowd along the Mall and Fleet Street and Ludgate Hill. On the morning of July 29th, an estimated 600,000 people lined those streets. Inside the cathedral, the light came through Christopher Wren's Great Dome and fell across the white and gold interior in a way that made every surface luminous. The television audience, globally, was estimated at 750 million. Sarah was the eldest of 5 bridesmaids. The others were India Hicks, 13, granddaughter of Earl Mountbatten; Catherine Cameron, 6, Sarah Jane Gasly, 11, and Clementine Hambro, 5, great-granddaughter of Winston Churchill. Wikipedia's account of the ceremony lists Sarah clearly as a bridesmaid among the 5. Getty Images caption language goes further, describing her in multiple photo archives as Chief Bridesmaid, a designation that appears frequently but isn't universally confirmed as an officially distinct role from the others. What is confirmed without dispute? She was the eldest by 4 years, and she walked that cathedral at the center of one of the most watched moments in recorded broadcasting history. She knew Diana. A photograph from 1983 at the Guards Polo Club shows the two of them together with the ease of people who encountered each other in private family contexts, rather than through the formal machinery of royal occasions. That ease had a history to it. Years of the same estates, the same cousins, the same family geography. Sarah had not been drafted into the bridal party as a ceremonial token. She was there because she was genuinely close to the family that was expanding to include a new member. And then, largely, she stepped back from it. That is the pivot the whole story turns on. She had been inside the mechanism on its grandest possible day, dressed, positioned, visible, a part of the ceremony that 750 million people watched. She understood what the machinery was. She understood what it demanded, what it consumed, what it did to the people it incorporated. In the years that followed, she chose the edges rather than the center. She continued to appear at family occasions, jubilees, funerals, the Sandringham Christmas service. But she didn't position herself at the heart of the apparatus. She showed up as a family member. She left as a painter. Choosing the edges, when you have stood in the middle, requires the conditions to make that choice viable. Those conditions were built, year after year, by the woman who brought her to Craigowan. The life she built in the years between the 1981 wedding and her own marriage in 1994 reads not as a withdrawal, but as a construction. Deliberate, sequential, shaped by real training. She had left Bedales School, a progressive boarding school in Hampshire, with a single A-level in art. She enrolled at the Camberwell School of Art in South London, then known as the Camberwell School of Art and Crafts, a serious and unglamorous institution in an unfashionable part of South London that had been producing painters and printmakers and designers since 1898. Camberwell operated, and still operates, without the overlay of royal prestige or West End gallery adjacency that surrounds art education at more fashionable addresses. The students draw from life. They spend hours with charcoal before they touch paint. It's a place that values looking over performing, making over narrating. Sarah Armstrong Jones enrolled there as a student, not as a patron. And what she learned there, the patient observation, the sensitivity to light, is legible in everything the Redfern Gallery has shown of her work since 1995. After Camberwell, she went to the Royal Academy Schools, one of the most rigorous and competitive fine art programs in Britain, with an acceptance rate so low that most graduates of Camberwell don't get in. The Royal Academy Schools take approximately 17 students per year. She was one of them. She followed that with 2 years in India, accompanying her father on the shoot for the 1984 David Lean production, A Passage to India. Lord Snowdon working as the film's production photographer, Sarah hired as an intern in the wardrobe department by the film's producer, John Knatchbull, 7th Baron Brabourne, who was connected to the family through the Mountbatten line. She studied wood gilding under her father's cousin, Thomas Messel. She learned what it meant to work with skilled craftspeople on real productions with real deadlines. Then she returned to England and enrolled in a 2-year course in textile and fabric design at Middlesex Polytechnic, what is now Middlesex University. This isn't a dilettante's resume. It's the education of someone who decided, early and seriously, to become an artist and pursued that decision through multiple institutions over the better part of a decade. She was building something real, and the family around her, the aunt at Balmoral, the steady structure of the royal estates every summer, provided the floor under the construction, not the construction itself. In India, on the margins of the A Passage to India production, she met a man named Daniel Chatto. He was working on a separate British film, Heat and Dust, a 1983 historical romance directed by James Ivory from a Ruth Prower Jubvala screenplay, shooting in India while A Passage to India was also in production nearby. He was an actor from a theatrical family. His father, Tom Chatto, had been an actor who died in 1982. His mother, Roz Chatto, was a prominent theatrical agent who died in 2012. He was, like Sarah, a person engaged with making things rather than simply observing them. He proposed, eventually, with a vintage cluster ring. They were both, fundamentally, people who understood what it meant to commit to a serious creative life without the guarantee of institutional support or public recognition. They married on July 14, 1994. The venue was St. Stephen's Walbrook, a church Christopher Wren rebuilt after the Great Fire of London, and which stands, discreetly, in the City of London, a few minutes' walk from the Bank of England. It's described as the grandest of Wren's parish churches, its dome an acknowledged precursor to the Great Dome of St. Paul's, but it holds, at most, a few hundred people. It isn't a national venue. It generates no procession route. The ceremony was officiated by the Reverend Chad Vera, a man who in 1953 had founded the Samaritans, the crisis support charity that now takes 12 million calls per year, after officiating at the funeral of a 13-year-old girl who had died by suicide, partly from the shame of not understanding her own body. That Vera was at the front of the church on July 14, 1994, is a detail the tabloid coverage of the wedding didn't dwell on. It belongs in the record nonetheless. A man who spent his life creating the conditions for people to speak about their worst moments without shame, presiding over the marriage of a woman who had grown up watching her parents' worst moments become tabloid property. Approximately 200 guests attended. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were there, as were the then Prince and Princess of Wales. The bride wore a gown by Jasper Conran and the Snowdon floral tiara, a piece her father had once given her mother on their own wedding day in 1960. The bridesmaids were her half-sister Lady Frances Armstrong Jones, Zara Phillips, daughter of her cousin Princess Anne, and a family friend named Tara Noble Singh. By every measure of royal weddings, the scale was deliberately and pointedly modest. The contrast with 1981 couldn't have been more considered. 13 years earlier, she had walked into a cathedral in front of 750 million people. She had now arranged to marry the person she loved in a room that held 200, conducted by a man who built sanctuaries for people in crisis, wearing her mother's tiara. Their sons, Samuel David Benedict Chatto, born July 28, 1996, and Arthur Robert Nathaniel Chatto, born February 5, 1999, grew up in a household defined by art and privacy. Samuel went to Eton and then to the University of Edinburgh, where he studied history of art. He now works as a sculptor and ceramicist based in West Sussex, exhibiting at the Redfern Gallery, the same Mayfair gallery where his mother's paintings hang, and at the Ram Gallery in Norway. Arthur also attended Eton and Edinburgh, reading geography. As of June 2022, he was serving with the Royal Marines. Samuel carves clay, Arthur serves in the military. Both chose real vocations. The vocation held across the generation. Sarah also became godmother, in these years, to 3 of the next generation of the family: Prince Harry, Lady Rose Gilman, and Lady Louise Windsor. That is a notable number of godchildren for someone who isn't a working royal. It marks clearly where she stood within the family's private geography. Trusted, present, part of the inner life, but not performing a role that required official management or press handling. Since 1995, Lady Sarah Chatto has exhibited her paintings at the Redfern Gallery in Mayfair. The gallery, on Cork Street near Bond Street, is one of London's oldest and most established commercial dealers. Founded in 1923, with a history that includes representing Lucian Freud and Barbara Hepworth. It isn't a vanity enterprise. Artists exhibit there because their work is good enough to sell on a competitive commercial market. She does not exhibit as Lady Sarah Chatto. She does not exhibit under her married name. She exhibits as Sarah Armstrong Jones, her birth name. The choice is deliberate and sustained across 30 years of practice, and it signals something precise about how she understands the relationship between her work and her position. The paintings belong to the person, not to the title. The Redfern Gallery's own description of her work characterizes it as rooted in memory and quiet observation, reflecting a sensitivity to landscape, light, and the subtle presence of everyday objects. Working in oil on canvas and in watercolor, she paints primarily landscapes and interiors, expressive, observational, grounded in a sensitivity to the physical world that connects clearly to those summers in the Aberdeenshire hills, to the particular quality of northern light she spent decades looking at before she knew she was training her eye. Curator Patrick Kinmonth described her work as a profound contemplation of the world she seeks to know and the method she has mastered. In her most recent Redfern solo show, over 3/4 of the pieces sold. She won the Windsor and Newton Prize in 1988 in her mid-20s. The Creswick Landscape Prize followed in 1990. She has shown at the Royal Academy summer exhibitions, alongside painters with no royal connection who wouldn't identify her primarily as anything other than a fellow artist. Since 2004, she has been involved with the Royal Ballet, first as vice president, then from 2024 as president, following the institutional footsteps of her mother, who had been the organization's patron. In September 2025, she donated a piece of her own work, a 2023 oil on canvas titled Studio Window, to raise funds for the charity Horatio's Garden, which creates accessible gardens for patients in spinal injury units. Art is such an important creative focus in Horatio's Gardens for patients with spinal injuries, she said of the project. I am really delighted to be able to help the charity to raise vital funds for people facing life-changing injuries. It's a rare instance of her own voice in public record, and it tells you where her attention runs, not toward the machinery of royal spectacle, but toward the specific, practical good that art can do for people in distress. Anne Glenconner, who served as Princess Margaret's lady-in-waiting for many years and knew Sarah since childhood, gave an account that survives in the public record. 3 days after Sarah buried her mother in February 2002, she was back at her painting. 3 days. That isn't the behavior of a person treating art as a hobby or a social obligation. It's the behavior of someone for whom the work is structural, the thing that holds the self together when everything else has given way. The studio was where she went to grieve, because the studio was where she had always gone. The habit ran that deep. The Queen looked at a niece with that quality and, apparently, didn't see any reason to disturb it. She never required Sarah to take on working royal duties. She never pressed her toward the official apparatus. Whether that was a conscious, articulated policy or simply an expression of love that happened to align perfectly with what Sarah needed is impossible to say with certainty. No letter, no formal statement, no recorded conversation establishes it as a deliberate program. What is sayable is that the outcome was consistent across 6 decades, and that consistency required the quiet cooperation of the most powerful person in the family. There is an argument that lives in the shape of what hasn't happened, and it deserves to be made carefully. Sarah Chatto has spent her entire life inside one of the most scrutinized families in the world. She has never published a memoir. No authorized biography of her exists. She has given almost no substantial interviews. One video that circulated online is titled accurately, "Lady Sarah Chatto said 4 words on camera in 2016. There have been no palace briefings against her. No anonymous sources have placed her at the center of any controversy. No letters have been leaked, no scores settled, no tell-all prepared." In a family that has produced, across the same decades, multiple catastrophic collapses of private information, from the sustained briefing war during the Wales marriage in the late 1980s and early 1990s, to the Newsnight interview in 2019, to the internationally broadcast Oprah conversation in 2021, Sarah Chatto has been not just quiet, but structurally uncontroversial. Some of that is temperament. She is described across sources, consistently and without exception, as loyal, discreet, and intensely private, and those qualities are clearly her own. But temperament alone doesn't explain a lifetime of institutional peace inside an institution that has been at active war with several of its own members across the same period. The other explanation is position. Sarah Chatto had no scores to settle because she was never given a reason to settle them. Nobody in the palace machinery felt threatened by her because she was never positioned as a rival or a problem to be managed. Nobody briefed against her because she gave them nothing to brief against. She wasn't competing for resources, for attention, for positioning in a post-institutional narrative. She was close enough to the family's emotional center that she was treated as trusted. She was absent enough from the working royal apparatus that she was never a subject of institutional management. That peculiar combination, inner circle affection, outer circle profile, is an unusually stable place to occupy inside a family that generally produces neither. The machine tends to destroy what it incorporates fully. What it leaves alone at the edges, it leaves largely intact. No biographer has produced a direct statement from the Queen saying she deliberately structured this outcome for her niece. That isn't how any of this operated, and it isn't the kind of thing the Queen would have articulated even had she thought it through systematically. What we have instead is the record. 6 decades of closeness, 0 institutional controversy, a private life that stayed private because it was never made into a battlefield, and a single named biographer, Sally Bedell Smith, placing the Queen specifically and purposefully alongside Sarah during one of the hardest periods of her adult life. This is editorial inference, and it's named as such, but it's inference grounded in every fact the record contains, assembled across sources that don't contradict each other. Princess Margaret died on February 9, 2002, at the age of 71. She had suffered several strokes in her later years, and her health had been declining for some time. Sarah, who had been present through the decline with a constancy that multiple accounts note, was at her mother's bedside when she died. A photograph from the months before Margaret's death, widely discussed at the time, captured Sarah in a moment of simple physical support. A daughter's hand on her mother's arm, the kind of gesture that doesn't perform for cameras and isn't constructed for an audience. It was noted when it circulated for what it communicated without trying to communicate anything, that the relationship between them was real and present and not managed. 6 weeks after Princess Margaret's death, on March 30, 2002, the Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge in Windsor. She was 101 years old. 2 women who had defined the emotional geography of the extended royal family, the Queen's sister and the Queen's mother, were gone within 42 days of each other. For a woman of 75, presiding over a family that had spent the previous decade in sustained public difficulty, These were two losses in rapid succession, and they came on top of a decade of institutional strain that Robert Hardman had already observed hit the Queen much more than she let on. In that atmosphere of concentrated grief, institutional and personal both, Sally Bedell Smith, whose books include Elizabeth the Queen and George VI and Elizabeth, recorded something specific. Drawing on her conversations with Lady Elizabeth Anson for an essay published on her Substack in 2023, Smith described a family event from the weeks following Princess Margaret's death. The Queen was there with her niece and nephew, David Linley and Sarah Chatto, whose own mother, Princess Margaret, had died 6 weeks earlier. It's a quiet sentence. It doesn't dramatize the moment. It doesn't reach for emotional language or interpretive framing. It locates the Queen, specifically with her bereaved niece, at a family gathering in the weeks of acute and particular grief. That is, a named biographer, drawing on a named primary source, who had direct access to the Queen, placing Elizabeth alongside Sarah during one of the hardest passages of Sarah's adult life. The detail is small. It was also remembered well enough and retained by a woman close enough to the Queen to have registered what it meant, that it made its way into the published record more than 2 decades later. Anne Glenconnor's account of what Sarah did in the days after the burial gives you the other half of that picture. 3 days after the funeral, she was back at her studio, back at the canvases. That detail speaks to character, the steadiness, the anchoring quality of a real vocation, and it's also a reminder that Sarah had not been given a reason to collapse inward, because the support around her had always been there. The aunt who brought her to the private lodge in Aberdeenshire was now the most powerful person at the heart of the family's grief, and she had also been the consistent, non-conditional presence through the years of Margaret's decline. In the years that followed Princess Margaret's death, Lady Sarah Chatto moved into a different kind of presence within the family, quieter in profile, but more central in trust. She appeared at Prince Philip's funeral in April 2021 at Windsor Castle, one of a restricted group of 30 guests permitted under the pandemic restrictions of the time. 30 people, not a crowd. A family circle, drawn tight by circumstances and by grief. She was in it. She attended the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June 2022, 4 months before the Queen's death. She showed up at the Sandringham Christmas service year after year with her sons, Arthur in his Royal Marines uniform when he was serving, Samuel in the quiet civilian clothes of someone who makes ceramics in West Sussex. A consistency of attendance that observers noted as characteristic of how she had always engaged with the family calendar. Not as a performer of royal duties, but as a family member who showed up. At the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II on September 19, 2022, at Westminster Abbey, the full ceremony of state, the most watched British occasion of the century, Lady Sarah Chatto was in attendance. She was photographed wearing jewelry from Princess Margaret's collection. That detail deserves a moment. The Queen and Princess Margaret had been sisters for 72 years. They had grown up together in the nurseries of Buckingham Palace and Royal Lodge during the Second World War, made their first joint radio broadcast in 1940, shared a childhood defined by the unexpected abdication of an uncle and the coronation of their father. When Margaret died in 2002, her jewelry passed to Sarah, not to an institution, not to a collection, but to her daughter. And Sarah, on September 19, 2022, wore some of it to her aunt's state funeral. Nobody issued a statement about the jewels. There was no press release, no stylist's note, no prepared interpretation. The choice spoke its own language, to anyone who knew the history well enough to read it. A daughter carrying her mother's memory to her aunt's farewell. The two women braided together across a lifetime, and the daughter standing at the meeting point between them. During coverage made for Queen Elizabeth's birthday celebrations in earlier years, one detail emerged and stayed in circulation. In the tribute material gathered from the extended royal family, Sarah Chatto was reported to be the only member of the family who used the word love. Not duty, not admiration, not service. Love. In a family whose public register defaults instinctively toward the formal and the ceremonial, toward the language of dedication and commitment and gratitude, that single word from a single person stood out distinctly. She had been close enough and trusted enough and held carefully enough for long enough that she could say it without ceremony or self-consciousness. It was simply the accurate word, and she was the one who reached for it. In April 2026, during the events marking what would have been the Queen's 100th birthday, Sarah was present at two centenary occasions. At the first, the private view of the exhibition Queen Elizabeth II, Her Life in Style, at the King's Gallery in Buckingham Palace, she was the person who greeted King Charles III and Queen Camilla as they arrived. Tatler described the outing as marking the beginning of 24 hours of centenary celebrations, and noted that Lady Sarah's presence was a reflection of the high esteem in which she is held. The following day, she was the only non-working member of the royal family to attend a second centenary event at the British Museum, to view the final design for the National Memorial to the late Queen. Tatler described her that day as eschewing any glossy outfits or press fanfare in favor of doing what she does best, getting the work done and celebrating family. In the post associated with the British Museum visit, Sarah described the occasion as marking the 100th anniversary of the birth of my beloved aunt, Queen Elizabeth II. Beloved. That was her own word. Chosen publicly, attached to her own name, published under her own authority. No intermediary, no press secretary, no management of the language by a communications team. Just the word she reached for, which turned out to be the simplest and most accurate one available. The same word she had apparently used years earlier in the birthday tribute material. A word that appears in her own voice, twice in the public record, in relation to a woman who is also the most powerful person in the kingdom. The story that connects all of these moments, the Balmoral summers, the 1981 wedding, the Wren Church in the City of London, the paintings hung at the Redfern Gallery under a birth name, the jewelry worn at a state funeral, the single word placed twice in the public record, isn't a story with a dramatic arc. It doesn't have the shape of a rescue or a confrontation. Nobody saved anyone. Nobody made a grand public declaration of protection or loyalty or love. What happened instead was slower and more durable. A relationship built over 6 decades through proximity, through private trust, through repeated small choices that accumulated into the conditions for an ordinary life inside an extraordinary institution. The Queen appears to have understood something specific about her niece from very early, that this was a person who needed space to be ordinary, and that the most powerful thing she could do was make that space exist and then hold it. She kept Sarah close. She brought her to the private places, to the stone house at the edge of the Aberdeenshire forest, among the very small number of people admitted to the most personal part of the year. She never required her to perform a role she hadn't chosen. She apparently understood, without making a production of understanding it, that a young woman who spent her summers teaching herself to read landscape light, who trained at Camberwell and the Royal Academy schools, who went to India on a film set and came back ready for more work, wasn't a person whose particular quality needed to be redirected toward the palace apparatus. The result, measured in what is absent from the record, is striking. No memoir, no controversy, no palace warfare, no scores. A family that has made several of its members miserable, in public, for years at a time, left this one member largely at peace. Her sons grew up in a household defined by craft and privacy. She has been president of the Royal Ballet since 2024. She continues to paint under her birth name. She shows up to family occasions with what every account describes as quiet, sustained loyalty. She uses the word beloved in public when she talks about the woman who brought her to the stone house in the Scottish Hills. Tatler described her in 2026 as someone who had stepped up to support her cousin King Charles. The loyalty that the Queen apparently cultivated now extending, quietly and without announcement, to the next generation. The protected niece has become the trusted insider. The woman who stood in the yellow dress at St. Paul's and then stepped deliberately back has remained, across 45 years of family history, the person the family trusts. That isn't an accident. It's what happens when the conditions for a private life are built carefully and held for long enough by someone with the power to hold them. Craigowan Lodge is still there. 7 bedrooms, granite walls, approximately 1 mile from the main castle in Aberdeenshire, at the edge of the forest, invisible from the road, the sort of place you'd drive past without knowing it was there unless someone showed you. After the Queen died at Balmoral on September 8, 2022, on the same estate that holds the lodge, in the hills where those summers were spent, the property passed to King Charles III. The tradition of beginning the Balmoral season at Craigowan continues. The particular use of it that belongs to this story is the Queen's. Paul Burrell put it simply. She wanted a cozy cottage to escape to. She chose who came with her into that space. Multiple sources, across multiple outlets, have consistently placed among those people the daughter of her sister, the niece she reportedly kept closest, in the smallest and most private enclosure she maintained. Not a head of state, not a prime minister, not a formal occasion. A niece, the only daughter of the only sibling the Queen ever had. A person who, because of how she was held, quietly, consistently, without conditions attached, managed to build something that the family more often prevented than produced. A private life, full of real work and real love, sustained across 6 decades inside one of the world's most watched institutions. The plain stone house in the Scottish Hills is where that bond has its most concrete address. It isn't a secret and it isn't a revelation. It's a confirmation. Modest and exact, and more telling than any public ceremony could have been. A queen who could bring almost anyone to the most private place she kept chose to bring this woman. And the woman she chose spent 60 years being exactly what the Queen apparently always understood her to be. Someone worth protecting. Someone worth keeping close. Someone who would stand at the British Museum in 2026, looking at the design for her aunt's national memorial, and reach without hesitation for the truest word she knew. The word was beloved. In a family that rarely got this right, the Queen got it right with Sarah. And the way you know is that Sarah never needed to tell you, because she was never given a reason to. If you want more stories like this one, the private histories that sit underneath the public record, subscribing to this channel is the best way to find them.